Welcome back to my latest project. When you go to the lumber store, do you find the really nice pieces? Or do you find the pieces that are maybe not as nice initially, but have promise? I prefer the second option. It's a little bit cheaper, but you can find some really incredible stuff. So go check out that bargain bin or that stack of lumber that your dealer is trying to get rid of. That's where the gold is. And that's kind of what I found here. The walnut was half price because it was not quite perfect. It had some cracks and things. But as long as you don't need the whole board, you can find some great stuff. And this in particular had some incredible figure in it. At half price, how can you go wrong? Did the same thing with the cherry, picked it up from the bargain bin. Again, a beautiful grain, some beautiful color. Why wouldn't I? That's a lot of intro to say, I'm making some boards. Step 1, mill it. As you can see, cut the boards to rough length. Ran them through the jointer to get some flat faces. Now to the table saw to even out the other side. And then we can start some glue ups. Minute and a half in, and I haven't even said what I'm making. It's like I'm thinking about different things. And I am. This one is all about the wood. It had to be the perfect wood. All the choices had to fit just right, so that the final product was exactly what it needed to be. Why, you ask? Because it's for somebody special. And when you're doing something for someone special, it has to be perfect. The project here is a tray to sit on one of the tables that I've built in a previous video, and it's for my wife. She works from home, and she's often on the couch, hanging out with the dog while she's working, and she needs somewhere to put her mouse that's nice and flat, somewhere to hold a drink so that she doesn't have to reach over the back of the couch to the table, and above all else, the wood has to be appropriate. It has to fit with the other wood that's in the space, the projects I've already built, and it also has to stand out. This is going to be a focal point and a centerpiece in that area, and therefore it has to stand out above the rest. Because I only have a 13-inch planer, I decided to do this main board in 2 pieces. Build 2 smaller boards, plane them down to get everything to the right thickness, the same thickness, and then joint them back together, glue them up, and I should have something that fits very, very nicely. If all the clamps are applied properly and everything is done very carefully, this board should come out nearly perfect, and with just a little bit of sanding, it'll all be nice and uniform and flat. I wouldn't have been able to fit this whole board through the planer at the same time, so this was the best way to get as close as possible. And frankly, it worked. I want to have a continuous grain running through the entire project here. So this board is actually the entire tray all in one. Once I've glued it all up and got my full length board and full width, I'll come back and start cutting it back down. By doing it this way, I'll make sure that the grain from the board wraps around all 4 sides. This should really make things pop, especially with some of the figure that's in here. As it transitions up through the side, it'll really give that sense of continuity. Had I done the sides of the tray separate, it would feel disjointed. It wouldn't feel like it made sense. And that's not the goal of this project. This one needs to be better than the rest. It needs to make sense. You can see here I'm trying to be very careful with all the clamps, applying just enough pressure in as many areas as possible, trying to ensure, using some cauls, that I get everything flat all the way through. Make sure that I get a good strong joint in the glue up. That's the only way that this is going to work. And if I foreshadow a little bit, I didn't do as good a job as I had hoped to. Later on in the video, you'll see that part of my glue up came apart. The good news is it was in a spot that was really easy to fix. But that still reminds me that I've got some improvement to do to make sure that I get better clamping force. That's probably going to mean more clamps and more careful application of glue to make sure that I get a good, thorough soaking of the surface with the glue anywhere that I want a joint to be. Things to learn. I wanted to do the majority of the sanding before I cut this all up. It's going to be much easier to sand this surface if it's all laying flat on one big board. So I went through and taped it. You see here, I've applied the tape, and I'm coming back with my marking knife and just scoring it enough so that I could remove the section of tape that is covering what will be an exposed surface, leaving just the thickness of the board that I have, so that when I cut this apart, all the surfaces that I want showing will be sanded. Didn't take a lot of video of the sanding. Don't know why, but frankly, you probably don't want to watch me sand anyways. I've shown so much of that. Next, I went to cut the board, and as you can see, I took the wrong video. I took the video before I cut instead of after. So just look at this arrow and imagine I ran this through the table saw. Best I can do. To try to make sure that everything came up as perfect as possible, I'm going to use some dominoes, a few on each side, into the base to make sure that I get a really good alignment. And that's critical because I'm trying to carry that grain all the way through, and I've got these tiny strips of maple that are running through. I need really, really good alignment, and I need to hold it very, very carefully. And some very good application of dominoes makes that really easy. I guess I didn't mention, what am I using here? The three pieces that make up the outsides and the center are walnut. All from the same board. Just cut it into pieces. And then I've got 2 pieces of cherry. And in between all of those pieces, I've got thin strips of maple. About 3/16 of an inch thick, just to provide some contrast. And you can see them sort of now, definitely when everything's finished. And they just give a little bit of a visual element to make things just pop that little bit extra. To make this glue up as easy and efficient as possible, I did it in 2 steps. First step, the 2 long edges. Glue those up, get them in proper. Make sure that I've got good clamping force. I expected I wouldn't be 100% perfect when I did this glue up, and as much as the dominoes help, there's still a good chance of having a slight imperfection. By doing this glue up first, I can take this back over to the table saw and very carefully trim off the edges to make sure that everything is just perfect. In order to make sure that I've got a good 90-degree angle everywhere, which will be important later, using those corner brackets and a few clamps, I can make sure that everything has good pressure and stays 90 degrees. And laying those clamps flat just allows me to distribute the pressure of those clamps a little bit more across the surface. As I mentioned, once everything was glued up and complete, took it over the table saw and just ran it very carefully through, taking just a whisker off. Just enough so that everything was perfectly flat. Now, I'm not a fan of what I'm about to do. To be honest, it was very uncomfortable while I was doing it. Running something through the table saw this way is definitely not the safest way to do it. I probably should have had a better way, but I wanted to be exactly perfect on how I ran this through. And so, this is the method I used, and it worked. I just had to be extremely careful. And that's maybe the name of the game. Sometimes You don't have the best way. But if you take the right amount of time to prepare and do things carefully, you can still get the job done. Now with that surface completely flat and flush, I can glue up the other ends. And that was the criticality of getting things flat. If there was anything not completely flat and flush here, you'd see a gap. Can't have gaps. That doesn't look good. Again, using the dominoes to line things up, and more so than the other sides, this is where they were really critical. Getting these ends with the tiny slices of maple running through perfect, that was important. Oh yeah, that was the moment. Right there. That's where I split the glue joint. Not ideal, especially not during a glue up. The good news is I can pop that piece off, put a little glue on it, add a few extra clamps, and we'll be okay. All the glue surface attached to it will be enough to make a good joint. Now, I also don't love butt joints, but on that vertical surface, it's not going to be the worst. And that's kind of half the point of the dominoes in this case. I needed something to make what is otherwise a half butt joint, a strong joint. The dominoes are the best thing. At least the best thing I've got. This isn't something that's going to take a lot of load. It's not going to be carrying big heavy weight or being abused in some way. It's for a drink here and there. So it doesn't have to be the strongest thing that I've built. It just has to work. With my mistake fixed and the damage corrected, I can continue on putting the second end on. Good news is, I didn't break this one. Probably because I was a little more careful. Live and learn. When I was cutting these pieces, I intentionally cut them just a little longer than they needed to be. Because I had done the first two sides just to the right length and cut them carefully, but off of the same piece as the short ends are. I had extra length on the short ends, and that allowed me to go a little long and come back and make them perfect. A little flush trim, no problem. This is something that I wouldn't have done in the past. I would have tried to have done it perfectly myself, and I never would have succeeded. The tools that I'm using and the skill level that I have, just not capable. It is what it is. But if I don't try to do it perfect and get close, and then use the tools and the skills I do have to dial things in, now that's the way to be successful. I don't love roundovers. Most of the things that I do, I try to be more square in my design. I'm sure you've noticed that. So a little bevel on each edge is a much better and more appealing design aesthetic to me than a roundover. So I've come back with the router, and I'll put a bevel on each of the edges. Maybe 1/4 of an inch. Just enough to smooth things out and give it that visual effect, but nothing huge. Being a tray, I wanted this to have handles. And I wasn't entirely sure that I could get good repeatability just on my own. The best thing I could think of, and the thing that everybody suggests for repeatability, make a jig. So, I'll do that. Using some particle board, I sketched out, as you can see here, the size of the handle I wanted. Using a Forstner bit, I could get perfectly rounded ends. And although I like a square design, in this case, rounded is better. Square wouldn't have been easy to sand, it wouldn't have looked as good. The round just does this particular feature justice. So, use the Forstner bit to get perfectly round ends, and then come back with the jigsaw and cut the gap between. I'll have to do some cleanup. The jigsaw is not perfect, and I'm not perfect, especially with a jigsaw. They've always been my nemesis. But it'll get me close enough, and I can use other tools to clean things up. This oscillating sander is one of those tools. It's one that I've had for a little while now, and I don't use it a ton. But for the jobs that I needed, something like this, it's super handy. It's also way handier when I set the feet and don't leave it up on its wheels. That's why it's rocking a bunch. Oh, to mistakes. But I got it done. With the profile exactly the way I wanted, I came back and marked using lines that centered it on the tray exactly where I wanted this to go. I wanted to hog out a lot of material first and then use the router to just finalize things. So, using a Forstner bit that wasn't quite big enough, I came in and drilled out each end, making sure I was nicely away from the line. And then again came back with the jigsaw to remove the entire center section. Okay, great. Most of the material's gone. Now, a little bit of two-sided tape, a couple of clamps, a patterning bit. Bob's your uncle. I don't have an Uncle Bob, so I don't know if that really works. But this did. Mostly. I won't show it here, but I didn't do a great job taping, and frankly, I think the tape that I have just wasn't good enough. That's something I've since replaced because I've had too many problems with it. But the pattern moved on me. How to fix that problem? Well, move the whole pattern, reset it, make sure it's clamped in perfectly, and cut again, carefully blending the two ends so that they run together. But of course that means I had to go back and redo the other side. Not ideal. In the end though, it turned out perfect. You wouldn't know it wasn't intended to be exactly the way that it is. And frankly, it probably fits my hand a little bit better than the old version did. While I might not be the one using it, certainly anybody else that is grabbing onto it will appreciate that. Put a little round over in the handle. Again, where the hand is touching predominantly, that's a good place for a round over. And with the round features already in that space, it made sense. With that done, I can come back and put the final bevels on. I'd waited to do this before because I needed that nice, crisp reference edge to apply the handles. Had I put the bevels in, I wouldn't have been able to reference that edge anymore. Now, of course, doing it after the fact, the router can't get into all those gaps, so a little chisel can clean up the ends. And then it's back to sanding. And the unfortunate part about a project like this with a lot of tiny faces or inside surfaces, a lot of that sanding has to be done by hand. And that takes a lot longer. I probably spent 2 to 3 hours hand sanding the fine details here, going up through each of the grits and making sure that I got it perfectly. That's just the nature of doing a project like this. Some of these things take a little longer, and that's okay. I did want to make sure that I had a perfect finish on the main surface of the tray. And so I very carefully used the orbital inside of the tray to create that finish. Made sure I didn't brush up against any of the edges. And at the edges, I had to sand those again by hand. But that small amount wasn't that bad. With everything cut, flat, smooth, sanded, it's on to finish. No surprises here. You guys know what I like to use. Although, I'll probably change it up soon. But for now, 2 coats of extra thin, 2 coats of Pollux. You saw the extra thin go on. Here's some Pollux. Of course, let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes in between, and then wipe it off to get rid of all the excess. And here it is. Something befitting of the space it's going in. Something that makes sense, but brings a pop. Something I hope my wife will love. I sure do. Thanks all. We'll see you on the next one.